Now let's look at our second division. The second division that we're looking at today is Pteridophyta. Pteridophyta. And that's the vascular plants that do not have seeds. So they have xylem and phloem, but they never produce a flower and they never have seeds. And the typical example that we're going to study is a fern. Ferns are non-flowering vascular plants. They have spore-bearing leaves, which we're going to talk about. They have a different kind of stem. You don't see it above ground, whereas most plants you see the stem and then you see leaves off of it. Their stem is underground, and it's horizontal, so it's growing along the ground under it. And then the leaves are what spring up from that, and so we only see the leaves because that's the only part that is above the soil. So the stem and the roots are actually under the soil. You don't need to know the statistics here, but commonly they get to 1 to 2 feet tall. A very common one is the Boston fern. You see that now all around being sold in stores. I even saw it at a grocery store being sold. Now, tropical ferns, they're amazing because the tropics and the ideal conditions for a fern, they can grow as tall as 60 feet with fronds, and that's the name of their leaves, being 12 to 14 feet. So imagine the tropical ferns. Now, some of the ferns are actually epiphytes, and an epiphyte lives on another plant or on another thing. In this case, it would be a plant, and it would not be a parasite, so it's not living off of that host. It's actually sustaining itself, but it lives on it. So that's an epiphyte, and some of these are. The parts of a fern you need to know: the leaves are called a frond, and the rhizome is that underground stem, and off of the rhizome then are the roots. And another structure that we're going to see on another picture, I think it's the next slide, are the spore-producing structures, and they're called sori, and it's a sporangium. And it's interesting because sporangium means a heap, and inside of them there's a heap of spores. I mean thousands of spores. The sori, which is plural of a sorus, will form at different times. Usually it's most ferns, it's going to be in the midsummer, like in July. And it's going to be on the underside of the leaf, and if you didn't know of its life cycle, you would think your plant has a disease. I mean, look at the one on the left, especially. You'd think, oh no, my plant's dying, it's got this disease. But this is natural, this is part of, and the sori are going to be very different depending upon which kind of fern you have. They're all different kinds of shapes, and as you can see, kidney, oblong, linear, curved, star-shaped, different colors. Those are the sori. And they have an alternation of generation as well. So they have a sporophyte generation, which are the sori. And if you can see the back of that frond, all those light rust-colored dots, those are sori. And that's the fern's life cycle. It usually starts in July on a lot of the ferns. And what come out of the sori then is going to be the spores. They're the spore makers. And from a spore, then what develops is this tiny green heart-shaped structure that's called a prothallus. It's only around like 7 weeks, so you don't see it. It's only one cell layer in thickness, so when you look at that, you would never guess that that's a fern. So that's not its dominant generation. From that prothallus, on it develops the male and female reproductive parts. The antheridia, producing the sperm, the archegonium, producing the ova. Usually they're located near the point and at the notch, but that can vary. This is actually fern sperm. And so the sperm is released from the antheridium to go to the archegonium to fertilize the ova to produce a zygote. And the zygote, when it develops, it sends out the first leaf, which doesn't really look like a fern, but the second leaf is the beginning of the production of the fronds. And they're called fiddleheads. And you can see, look at the shape of them. They look like the end of a fiddle. And that's how the leaves, new leaves of ferns are made. And they're coiled up. Some of them from some of the ferns are actually delicacies in salads in some of your high-end restaurants. And here's again showing you the alternation of generations of the life cycle. And you can see that the prominent generation is the one that produces the spores. So the Sporophyte generation is the predominant generation of ferns. Whereas in the moss, the predominant generation was seeing the rhizoids and the leafy shoots and the, now I've lost my thought, but the thing above the ground. And so that is the predominant generation. So that is the gametophyte generation. So make sure you know for the quiz that the predominant generation for moss is the gametophyte generation, and the predominant generation for a fern is the sporophyte generation. Ferns usually require 3 to 7 years to reach reproductive maturity before they go through that life cycle, but as they are maturing, they can grow new fronds all the time, those fiddleheads first. So the dominant generation is the sporophyte, as I said. You don't need to know what a prothallus and prothalli and all that, what they're called. They only live about 3 to 7 weeks. That's why we don't call it a fern. You don't recognize it as a fern. And so it's not the predominant generation. Some other seedless vascular plants are the club moss, the whiskfern, and the horsetail. Club moss is also known as ground pine because how it grows low to the ground and also in temperate regions. And there's an example of what it looks. It's not very high again, but it does have vascular tissue. Horsetail is quite unique, and all of the species except one has become extinct, but the other one that's not extinct is very predominant. And this is when all the leaves are off, and this is what's left. And the epidermis in these stalks, they contain a glass-like substance that's called silica, and you do need to know that. Therefore, that makes its feel very rough. And so back in the colonial times, when you couldn't go to the store and buy a Brillo pad or an SOS pad or something to scrub your pots and pans, they actually went out and picked the horsetail, and they used it to scour their pots and pans before we had made SOS pads and Brillo pads. So that's quite unique. Here's another example showing you it with the actual leaves on it. So horsetails have small leaves that grow in circles around the stem. And horsetail stems are hollow, and they contain tissues which contain the silica. It's a mineral in sand that makes them very abrasive, so they could actually do a pretty good job of scrubbing the pots and pans.